it remains to be seen exactly how disruptive this period is and in what way. But the world that we left was a world in which institutions were already in distress. And this is true, I think, of sort of international institutions of governance, the UN, its kind of constituent groups, overall international relations, I think had gone through a period of decline. There was this sort of consensus, I think, among commentators that globalization had already started to recede in many ways. One interesting facet of that world was that sort of decline and decay was also filtering down to much more sort of tangible local levels and was manifesting itself in ways that were, pretty evident to everyday people. And I think this is seen in terms of the effects of technology on our lives and kind of how that has played out over the last couple of decades. It's been seen in terms of more traditional institutions, certainly the media, the independent media in particular, and the independence of media in general. I think it's true of even sort of government institutions, not just in the US. And you have to keep in mind that I'm coming from kind of the US perspective, but I think this is true in a lot of other countries as well. The erosion of the independent judiciary, for example, and this is happening in a number of places, and not just confined to the US or to places like Brazil, but also in Europe, places like Poland, for example. The EU as an institution, as sort of part of the post-war project of Europe, is another one of those institutions. Was already seeing a kind of decline. It was having some successes, but also was under duress. One of the effects of this moment is that it will sort of accelerate and apply additional pressure to those pain points that we were already seeing around the world.
And the question that comes to my mind is, if we learn from history, in which ways is this crisis different from the ones that came before?
I think in some respects we're kind of lucky that this crisis happened now and as opposed to, say, maybe 20 years ago. One of the differences with this crisis is that we do have many tools at our disposal to get through it. So technology, and as is always the case, is often sort of a double-edged sword. The ability for large chunks of the economy to actually keep going, owes that to technology in many respects. This wouldn't have been true 20 years ago. It probably would have been less true 10 years ago. In some respects, I think this crisis is a little different because we actually have some level of resiliency that is kind of given to us by technology and by the tools that we have, not to mention the medical advances, which are potentially, going to help with actually stemming the crisis itself in terms of the virus. But at the same time, the fact that technology is so kind of interwoven into our lives and into the modern world also presents a number of risks, and it presents a number of challenges. The spread of misinformation is probably something that is, certainly has been it's been a universal phenomenon throughout human history, but never at this scale. And I think that's one of the unique challenges we face, especially as we look to strengthen democratic institutions in the wake of this event. And I think that's going to be one of the unique challenges that we face going forward.
And with this death of independent journalism and this growth in disinformation, where do you see the dangers in the upcoming times, and what are the dangers that disinformation brings?
A recent study, a study that was recently kind of uncovered by the Wall Street Journal, showed that Facebook, by its own data, discovered that something like 64%, I think, of memberships of extremist groups on the platform probably wouldn't have actually joined those groups were it not for Facebook's own recommendation algorithm. And this is something that's pretty alarming. So these platforms have the effect, it's pretty clear, of actually amplifying and reinforcing those factors that they've already sort of introduced and have empowered. YouTube also has, as we all know, kind of a similar, you might see it as a flaw, but I think from the perspective of the product designers, they see it as a feature, the ability to kind of essentially hook people, but actually hook them in ways that are more addictive and ultimately we've seen more destructive. So those are, I think, a lot of the risk factors, and there's really no clear answer to what to do about it in our current state. These companies are left to sort of their own devices in many respects. There have been proposals to regulate them. Many of those proposals are also potentially flawed and sort of alarming. And so a world in which social discourse is managed and controlled by a handful of these platforms is a pretty dangerous world. And I think what we're going to see over the next few years is that trend actually increase, hard as it might be to believe.